India has put a target for itself, and this is something that India announced even during COP20, that we will have net zero emissions by 2070. To be able to achieve that, we have also put a target for ourselves of 500 gigawatts of non-fossil fuel capacity, of renewable energy capacity by 2030. Essentially, 50% of our renewable energy supply is going to come from renewable energy sources. We had also put in a target that 40% of our renewable energy is going to come, 40% of our total energy is going to come from non-fossil fuel sources by 2030. But in 2021, we already achieved that target by having over 150 gigawatts of renewable energy. If we talk about this energy ecosystem, if we talk about how from 175 gigawatts today, we will move to 500 gigawatts in 2030, how the achievements that we've already achieved right now of significant amount of solar, hydro, wind, biopower, there has been a lot of impetus on renewable energy and clean energy that the government has been putting in the country. I want to give you a 2-minute history on how that actually happened. How was it that India built this ecosystem? I'm sure a lot of you are aware that when India started off with renewable energy, the prices were really high. It was not comparable to thermal in any way. And today we are sitting in a situation where renewable energy is cheaper than thermal energy in the country. We're actually looking at a price of just around 2 cents for a kilowatt. That is the kind of energy availability in renewable that India has been able to generate. How we did this was, initially government came up with something called the viability gap funding. Every time a project would come up in the country for generation of renewable energy power, and it was not viable because of very, very high costs of solar panels, technology that was still not very advanced. To make such projects viable in the country, the government would give somewhere between 20 to 40% of the project cost to the private party to make sure that the project becomes viable. The second big thing that the government did was to make sure that there is a demand that is available. So almost all government entities were necessarily asked to procure a percentage of all of their energy requirement from renewable energy sources. The third big piece that the government did is, anytime you're talking about renewable energy, it is extremely important that you can get it connected to the grid. The entire electricity grid for movement of electricity in the country needs to have renewable energy sources. To be able to do that, the country created a lot of renewable energy parks. We created solar parks, wind parks, a hybrid of solar and wind parks. All of trunk infrastructure was made available in these solar parks. All of grid connectivity was made available in these parks. So all a private party had to do was to come in and position themselves in these parks and start generating power. We've also come up with various other initiatives within the government, and I'll talk specifically about how we're looking at now manufacturing through various sources such as 100% FDI is allowed. There was again assured offtake that I spoke about, wherein long-term power purchase agreements were signed by the government to make sure there's significant amount of demand and assurance of revenue within the Indian ecosystem. So once we created that big ecosystem wherein demand is created, there is a trunk infrastructure and basic infrastructure available in the country. We created a supply source as well in the country by all of these tenders that were done by the central government and state governments, because of which we created a capacity of 150 gigawatts. The next target for us as a country, and that is something where we are working on at present, and that is certainly something where Taiwanese companies can partner really well with India, is technology. I gave you a perspective of how we were able to bring down our costs of renewable energy to almost 2 cents per kilowatt hour. And the reason we could do that is there was a significant amount of investments and knowledge and innovation that went into creation of technologies which can be used for this renewable energy. Today, we are sitting in a position that we've had a significant amount of dependence on one single country for all of our solar panels. To make sure that we can become self-sustainable and we can take care of the large targets that we have, we are talking about 500 gigawatts in the end of the day. To be able to create that kind of ecosystem within the country, we are now looking at a large-scale manufacturing of solar panels within the country. We as a country are looking at providing various kind of incentives, and I'll talk about them a little later in the presentation. But while we provide all of these incentives, it is imperative for us to get the kind of technologies which will help us reach that target. And I think that is a great area of collaboration between India and Taiwan. So while we want to bring down our dependence on one single country for our solar panels, one solution that we brought about for ourselves is that of a production-linked incentive. This is again a learning that we for ourselves took from our electronics sector. To give you a little bit of a history, I'm sure a lot of Taiwanese companies are aware of how well established the electronics manufacturing ecosystem in India is now. But there was a time when India had a saying that electronics is the new oil problem in India. The reason for that was that most of our electronics had to be imported into the country from other nations. We only had 3 factories which were manufacturing electronics, including mobile phones in the country. India took a lot of steps. We came up with something called a production-linked incentive. We brought about a lot of focus on ease of doing business. We made policies which were competitive globally and not just within India. And today, we have more than 223 factories which have become mobile phone and electronics manufacturers in the country, making India a net exporter of electronics as against a net importer. That learning is exactly what we now want to use and duplicate in our solar story as well. We, as I mentioned, more than 85% of our solar panels right now are coming from a neighboring country. We want to reduce that dependence, which is why we are talking about coming up with the solar PLI. The PLI functions in a way that you have of all the production, if you meet the criteria that has been set by the government, if you meet the criteria, then 3 to 5% of the total production cost of solar PV modules will be given by the government of India. This makes production in India absolutely viable and competitive with developed nations within Europe, US, including Taiwan.